Hello, my name is Sarah Lindsay. My student number is 159954447, and the question that I'd like to answer today is the impact that the practice context had on my interventions with my patient. The first factor that I'd like to talk about was the tendency for the prac placement, which was a hospital, to have inappropriate patients brought from acute wards into the rehabilitation ward. An example of this was I had a patient who had congestive heart failure brought into the ward. He was a very, very unwell person, and he eventually was put onto the palliative pathway and sent home to be with his family. The problem with that was I still had to do an initial assessment, which, because of his conscious levels were fluctuating, I then had to contact his wife and his daughters to try and get the information. So this was quite a lengthy process, and it actually impacted on my ability to see the patient that was in my case study. And yeah, that was very, very time consuming to be able to do that, particularly for a patient who was not rehab appropriate at the time. The second thing I'd like to talk about is the policies and procedures in regards to patients who have been orange carded. So my patient was given an orange card because he tested positive to golden staph or MRSA, and this meant that he was not allowed to leave his room. So that made that really difficult because I had all these assessments that I needed to complete. I was able to do my initial interview or initial assessment and my shower assessment in his room. However, as far as doing a kitchen assessment and other assessments that were required outside of the room, this was virtually impossible due to the fact that there was a fear that he might contaminate other patients in the ward, which is something that must be avoided in a hospital. The next thing that I'd like to talk about is the time constraints. So once my patient had his orange card lifted, he was therefore allowed to venture out of his room and into the ward. The only problem with that was there was an increase in pressure to make sure that I had all of my assessments done and I had done most of my interventions so that he could be discharged. He's currently still in hospital, but there was still that pressure from Medico and the hospital to try and get him done as quickly as possible. The other thing that made it difficult is once he had the orange card lifted, the other allied health professionals and members of staff wanted to see him as well, so it was quite difficult to try and get time with him. And often I would find I would go into the room and there would be either the physiotherapist working with him or some other profession working with him at the time, so that definitely added to the time constraint within the practice context. Another thing that I'd like to talk about was the fact that there was definitely an emphasis on the medical model within the hospital. I don't think that's new news, but I definitely found it difficult to try, and as much as I wanted to do many other things with him in regards to his valued occupations, there was definitely a need for me to just focus on his ADLs. So by ADLs I mean being able to safely mobilise and work in a kitchen, to be able to shower himself, to be able to dress himself, and transfers. So those were the 4 things that were the emphasis, and I found it quite difficult to be client-centred and focused on other occupations when you need to just constantly be focusing on ADLs. So as a student, I found that quite challenging. The last thing that I'd like to talk about is the government reforms and how that's impacted. So there's been a lot of budget cuts and a lot of reforms from the government that's filtered down to the hospital, and this has meant that the amount of resources and the amount of funding that the hospital has is a lot less. This meant that trying to get resources for my patient or trying to advocate for my patient to have certain services by liaising with the social worker to be very, very challenging. And these were the practice context things that impacted on my patient. Thank you.